Okay, let's go ahead and talk a little bit about the Spanish-American War. It takes place in the late 1800s, referred to by one congressman of the day as a splendid little war. Called so because the war didn't last very long, it lasted for a few months, and we had very few casualties. And the United States, really, it's where we gained an empire. It's where we became a world power or a global power, gaining territories in the Philippines, Guam, Puerto Rico, Cuba. And so, again, really what establishes the United States on the world scene. It doesn't begin actually as a war between Spain and America. Rather, it begins really as a Cuban civil war, as a Cuban revolution. Cuba had been a colony of Spain, and by the late 1800s was ready to break away. The primary leader of this revolution was a guy by the name of Jose Marti, a very intelligent literary figure, a writer, a poet, and he's kind of thought of as kind of the George Washington of Cuba. He's the guy who really instigates a lot of the Cuban Revolution. In fact, his ideas were so kind of revolutionary that Spain actually exiled him from Cuba, and he spent time in exile up in New York City. And Jose Marti realizes that if he wants to go ahead, if Cuba wants to gain its independence, it really can't do it by itself. It doesn't have the military might to challenge Spain, who at the time was really one of the major world powers in Europe, although it was in decline. But he realizes they would need help, and the closest place to get help was the United States. And to that end, he begins a tactic by the Cuban rebels of burning American sugar plantations. Jose Marti realizes that if there's anything that's going to get the United States involved, it's a threat to U.S. property. And so again, the burning of the sugar plantations wasn't done really because they were angry with the United States or upset. They were trying to provoke a response by the United States so that the U.S. would step in. Another thing that is done that really kind of provokes a response from the United States is done apart from the revolutionaries, apart from the rebels. It's done by the Spanish government. They appoint a guy by the name of General Weyler, Weyler, to be the general in charge of Cuba, to be the governor. And he has a problem. These rebels practice guerrilla tactics, so he doesn't know who the good guys and the bad guys are. And he doesn't want to go around just killing innocent villagers. So he comes up with this idea of, well, we'll go into every village, we'll try to identify who the good guys are, we'll try to identify who the bad guys are, and we'll separate them out. The good guys will put over in a camp that he calls a reconcentration camp, and anybody then left in the village we know will be a bad guy. And so we'll go in and fight the bad guys then. And the good guys will be safe. Unfortunately, the reconcentration camps are a disaster. There's not very good hygiene. The food supply is not adequate, so there's lots of disease, there's hunger. Conditions in the camps are terrible. And because of that, because of the people who die from disease and things like that in the camps, he gets the nickname in the American press, perhaps unfairly, of the Butcher. And so he's seen as an oppressor and somebody that the Americans really can kind of rally against. There's a group of newspaper publishers who are more than willing to take advantage of this. It's known as the Yellow Press. The two guys who really are most indicative or most symbolic of the Yellow Press are Joseph Pulitzer, for whom the name Pulitzer Prize is awarded, and William Randolph Hearst. And they go ahead and they're in competition with one another. They want to sell the most papers. And Pulitzer on the East Coast, Hearst is primarily on the West Coast. But they're trying to go ahead and sell as many papers as they can. And they realize that the more sensational the headline, the more crazy the headline, the more likely somebody is to buy their paper. So much so that does it matter if it's exactly true? Not so much. And so they are known actually for publishing lies, especially during this time period. Things like the Spanish fed children to sharks. Is there really any historical evidence of this happening? No. Did the American people believe it? Well, sure, the press said it. We tend to believe what the press says, probably to our detriment. They published stories about wells being poisoned. Were any wells poisoned by General Weyler or the Spanish? Again, the historical evidence is scant, and so the answer is probably no. But nonetheless, the Americans were offended. They couldn't believe this stuff was happening. They bought it hook, line, and sinker, and they wanted to go to war. In fact, the newspaper publishers wanted to go to war too. Again, because they understood that war, that fights, conflict, sells newspapers. If you want to understand the concept, look no further than any local public middle school or public high school. Anytime there's a fight in the hallways and somebody yells fight, immediately a crowd draws. We're drawn to it. And the same is true of a war. As soon as the war breaks out, everybody goes out and buys a paper because they want to find out what's going on. And so again, their goal to sell papers, they wanted to actually precipitate a war because it would sell more newspapers. Another thing that really kind of pushes the United States towards war is the Delome letter, written by the Spanish minister to the United States, Enrique DuPuy Delome. and he writes this letter, and he's really just doing his job. The job of any minister or ambassador to a foreign country is to offer insight and evaluation of what's going on in the country in which they are an ambassador or a minister. And so the Spanish were understandably concerned that the United States was going to get involved, so they asked Delome to go ahead and, well, what do you think? If we go ahead and we crack down on the Spanish rebels, will McKinnley, who was the president at the time, will he respond? Will this precipitate a war? And he offers an honest evaluation. Delome writes the letter back and says, no, McKinnley basically panders to whatever the people want, and he's not going to risk a war. He's basically a big chicken, is what he says. And that's obviously a gross oversimplification. But he goes ahead and writes this. His mistake was not in writing it. His mistake was in sending it in the mail. Generally, when ambassadors write stuff that's sensitive like that, they'll send it via courier. In other words, they're going to give the letter to a person, they're going to buy him a ticket for a boat or an airplane, and send him to the country they need to get to deliver the letter in person. Delome doesn't do that. He drops the letter in the mail. And at the time, all the mail that went from the United States to Spain went through Cuba. Some Cuban postal worker down there, kind of probably a little bit bored, maybe some sympathies with the rebels, sees a letter from Delome come across his desk, says, oh, a letter from the Spanish minister to the United States. He opens the letter, reads it, and says, oh my goodness, he just called McKinnley a big chicken. And so he leaks this to the Cuban rebels, who then give it to Hearst. Hearst publishes it all over the newspaper, and now McKinnley, like any little boy on the second grade playground, when somebody calls you chicken, you gotta prove that you're not a chicken. And so he had to save face, and that's one of the things that leads us into the Spanish-American War. What I have here is actually an excerpt from the letter. You can go ahead and pause the video now and read through it, but this is where basically McKinnley is called a weak president and a panderer and things like that. The last thing, the straw that really breaks the camel's back and brings us into the war, all these things lead up to it, the Yellow Press, the Delome letter, but the last thing that really brings us in is the U.S.S. Maine. The U.S.S. Maine was the United States' first battleship, and we had sent it down to Havana Harbor to protect U.S. citizens and U.S. interests. In other words, it was a show of force. By this time, the battleship's already getting kind of old. It's been around for a while, and so we go ahead, we send it down, and it blows up in the harbor, February 15th, 1898. Till this day, we really don't know what caused the explosion. From everything we can ascertain, the explosion went from inside out. It was probably a coal bunker. The coal bunkers were empty. Coal dust is highly flammable and explosive. There was probably a static spark there. It was probably an accident. But nonetheless, William Randolph Hearst blames the Spanish. Says the Spanish killed this. They killed 260 sailors, and this goes ahead and sparks the rallying cry for the Spanish-American War, remember the Maine, and we get involved in the Spanish-American War after the sinking of the U.S.S. Maine. So now we have to invade Cuba. There's two parts to this. The first part of the invasion is the Navy. The Navy goes ahead and blockades Cuba, and the purpose for the blockade is to find and destroy the Spanish-American fleet. We find the fleet in Santiago Bay. The commander of the U.S. forces was a guy by the name of Admiral Sampson. The commander for the Spanish forces was a guy by the name of Pascual Severon. And we had them outmatched. Our fleet was a modern fleet, according to the recommendations of Maine. We had all metal ships. We had steam-powered ships. The Spanish fleet was still a wooden fleet with sail power. And the Spanish had old cannons. We had modern cannons that were breech-loading and rifled, so we had a better range than they did. We could shoot them from further away. Really, the Spanish had no chance. And Severon knows this. He knows he needs to get out of open water. He needs to run the blockade and try to sneak away. He makes that attempt on July 3rd, 1898, and he almost gets away with it. He actually sneaks past our blockade, and we have to go chase him down. And we end up catching up with him, and we sink the entire Spanish fleet with, I believe, one casualty. I think one sailor suffered from heat exhaustion and died from that. But other than that, they weren't able to even touch us. So the Navy, infinitely prepared. Now we can go ahead and land our troops. We don't have to worry about the Spanish fleet any longer. The Army was a different story. The Army wasn't organized. It wasn't prepared. A lot of equipment was old. The guns were old. The uniforms were of the same style that we used in the Civil War, meaning that they were navy blue and they were wool and they were dark, which means that they were not well suited for the Cuban environment, which is hot and humid. So our soldiers, again, poorly prepared, and not ready to go. We send down about 17,000 troops. That turns out to be enough to do the job. One of the more notable groups that goes down is a volunteer group, a volunteer cavalry group called the Rough Riders. They are led by Teddy Roosevelt. At the outbreak of the war, Teddy Roosevelt was the Secretary of the Navy. He resigns that post because he doesn't want to miss out on the excitement of the war. He wants to go fight a war. Roosevelt, a little bit of a glory hound, actually probably a lot of a glory hound, and was looking to go ahead and grab his share of the glory in the war here. The most notable battle that this Rough Riders took part of was the Battle of San Juan Hill, which interestingly enough didn't actually occur on San Juan Hill. It occurred on Kettle Hill. But the reporter who was there covering it decided that Kettle Hill just wasn't very romantic, and there was this hill next door called San Juan Hill. He goes, oh, that sounds much more romantic, much more Latin. And so he calls it the Battle of San Juan Hill. So we know it today as the Battle of San Juan Hill, even though that wasn't accurate. Just remember, you can't always believe what you read in the newspaper or see on the news. And this is evidence of that. So we go ahead and win in the end, and we signed the Treaty of Paris of 1898, which ends the war. And as a result of that treaty, the United States becomes a world power. We are now a global power. We defeat a major European power. We go ahead and we claim an empire. We get Guam, we get Puerto Rico, we get Cuba, we get the Philippines from Spain. So really, we get a lot from the war. And it's really one of the things that makes the United States the modern country that it is today.